Okay, we're going to continue with chapter 8. Hopefully everyone has their notes packages. Please put away your phones. Thank you very much. 2 packages? 3?
No, it's just something.
So chapter 7 was all about rejecting liberalism. We looked at both fascism and communism. Both of them have many similarities. Now we're going to look at how communism and liberalism collided. We're going to particularly study the Cold War and some of the responses that the Western world or the liberal world took to deal with some of the challenges brought up. Okay. Again, the main issue is to what extent can ideological conflict influence international relations. Okay, we're going to look at some of the tension that was built, how that escalates, and how to reduce that. Okay, as already mentioned, the chapter focus is the Cold War. How many of you have already heard of the Cold War? Raise your hands. Okay, a couple of you. I think we briefly discussed it in grade 11. The Cold War took place, well, this particular Cold War took place between 1945 and 1991. It was a conflict between the communist Russia, the Soviet Union, and essentially America, but many of the nations in the free world. It shaped international relations, it shaped a lot of the way we conduct things, and to this day, quite frankly, there's a reason why everyone in the West is up in arms with Russia invading Ukraine, and the role that NATO has to play in that, and even why Vladimir Putin would invade Ukraine as well. Okay. It's important to keep in mind that the Cold War is a political, economic, and social struggle. It covers all areas of life. It was fought not only with guns, tanks, planes, and people, but it was also a conflict that took place on various sports platforms as well. I know that there's a whole thing you can look online about how the Cold War was acted out even in the ice hockey rinks at the international level, in the Olympics to an extent. Side note, rejection of liberalism with Nazism. There was in 1936, I believe they were called the Nazi Olympics. The Olympics were held in Germany, particularly Berlin, and Adolf Hitler is trying to prove the superiority of the Aryan race. There's a athlete from back then, I believe his name is Jesse Owens. There's a really good movie about him on Netflix. He was I guess he was a multi-sport athlete. Particularly, he was a black athlete, and he just absolutely dominated those Olympics, broke a bunch of records, and put old Adolf away in that regards. But both of these ideologies, again, one is expressing liberalism, that would be America and the West, and the other is, so that would be individualism. The other is expressing collectivism, that would be Russia and the Soviets and the communists. They're not only trying to win over one another, but they're also trying to influence other countries in the world, right? So particularly, how many of you are familiar or aware of the Vietnam War conflict? So from my understanding, most of that was due to the expansion of communism and the Americans trying to prevent that. The conflict in Afghanistan in the late 80s and 90s, anybody aware of that? Do you know anything about that as well? A little bit, right? Yes, you may. I have a lecture on that we'll get to later. Again, that was the Soviets trying to get into Afghanistan for the resources, and the Americans, trying to prevent that from happening. So in grade 12, we don't really look closely into the details of World War II. But just a reminder, obviously, Germany and Japan lost. Russia initially was teamed up with Germany. Halfway through, for whatever variety of reasons, they changed sides, and part of the reason why Germany is defeated is because they're fighting a war on multiple fronts, right? So particularly if you take a look at the map back here, Germany is right there, this small country, and Russia is this big giant landmass, and so Europe over here is fighting Germany from the west, and then from the east you have Russia coming in, and Germany loses. Okay. But it's not as if Russia was exactly on the side of the West and the free world. They had their own agenda in mind, and you know, the Allied powers, so that would be America later in the war, France, Britain, which would be the two main ones really in Europe. You know, they kind of make this claim that they won, but they did that by getting into bed with the communists and joining sides with people who had no interest in democracy, freedom, or equality for the citizens. And so when the war comes to an end, they divvy up Germany, and they divvy up, well, okay, let's just focus on the Germany part. They split up Germany into various places that they control, but once Russia gains certain part of control, right, this collectivist, I don't know what those bells were, this collectivist communist ideology, once it takes control of East Germany and East Berlin, they set up what was known as the Iron Curtain, which, you know, there's a small picture here. It's kind of hard to tell, and that might not be a well-developed part, but the Iron Curtain was essentially a wall that separated these two areas, right? And most of the wall, well, I'll tell you that later. The Iron Curtain symbolized the ideological conflict and physical boundary dividing Europe into two separate areas from the end of World War II in 1945 until the end of the Cold War in 1991. Okay. This is interesting. I don't know why I have this image with NATO, but anyways, if you just look at some of the colors here, so this darker red is Soviet Russia, USSR, 1938. This lighter color they annexed or expanded into the Soviet Russian states. Okay, so we're seeing a part of Ukraine is there as well, also with this Belarus area. You know, so the communists are attempting to expand, whether that be a lot of it, if you look at history in this slideshow as well, a lot of it was done primarily through force. You have their satellite states in the brown and this lighter pink color as well. So all of this Eastern European area are the nations that were most dramatically affected by communist Russia. If you go into these countries, although they may be very beautiful and there's a lot of culture there, you know, you still see the impacts of that communist philosophy, the collectivist and anti-capitalist, let's say classical liberal ideology. Like a lot of what I'm trying to say is that a lot of these countries are very poor. Obviously not Germany, but you know, these are not very wealthy countries. That's because while the world was expanding rapidly after World War II, international trade, new modes of transportation and communication, while the world is being globalized, which you learned a little bit about in grade 10, Russia, behind this area of the world behind the Iron Curtain, is excluded from that intermingling of people, and so they lag behind. Okay. So anyways, that last slide was a little bit about NATO and the West and how they formed a pact to protect themselves and to ensure that the threat of communism in Russia was dealt with, particularly Russia, because NATO didn't play as big of a role in other conflicts. The Soviets have their Warsaw Pact, which includes the Soviet and Eastern Bloc nations, so this would be the Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. And both of these sides, because of their belief system, view the Iron Curtain in a different manner. For the classical liberal individualistic ideology, capitalist, the West, they saw the Iron Curtain as, but if we go back, they saw it as a barrier meant to contain those oppressed by communism. So it's basically like a giant open air prison. You know, you couldn't go over and through this wall freely. In fact, actually, Mr. Heck went across it, so you could ask him about that.
Oh, dang.
And it was also a restriction to civil and economic freedoms, whereas the people, and obviously this mentality wasn't necessarily shared by everyone. We'll get into that as well. But generally speaking, the Soviets would have viewed this as a protection from capitalistic influences and protecting themselves from the potential expansion of fascism.
Hey, Mr. Kawaja, a nearly related question, right? Russia, after the Soviet Union collapsed, are they like powered by the mafia?
It really depends on what you can, like, okay, if mafia is just organized criminals, then, I mean, the government acted in that way. Like, again, Stalin had his own secret police, so he had his goons to enforce his rule. Many people do not have a lot of freedom. Like, I don't know exactly what you mean by mafia. Like, like, obviously there's Russian organized crime.
Well,
right?
Have you seen that trailer for the Bert Kreischer movie?
No.
No, never mind. We'll go on.
Bert Kreischer's a comedian. I know the story. Yeah.
What story?
Bert Kreischer, he's a comedian. He went to Russia. He was on the train. He's very drunk.
Oh.
He got involved with the Russian mafia somehow.
Yeah.
But they liked him because he was funny.
So that's how I got
This stuff is much worse because, you know, like 20 million people died.
Yeah, you're right. Because in that movie, Mark Hamill plays his dad. So.
Let the man teach, man. I'm here to learn, man.
I know.
Okay, so just to give you an idea of this map, again, this is Italy. Over here, this would be like Portugal. No, this would be Portugal. This is probably Spain. I believe that's France, and that's likely Germany. So this pink stuff is all Russia. And there's a barrier essentially blocking Russia and the other, like the western part of Europe, right? And what else do I really want to say about that? Okay, so NATO is blue, and the red is the Warsaw Pact. So again, this is all communism, and this is all, you know, the free world, more or less. Right? The black line divides them, and then what was the green?
What's a gray one actually?
The gray is just they're neutral, right? So like some of the Scandinavian countries in the north, like well, I don't know if you really look into the history, like I'm pretty sure the Swiss had Nazi gold in their banks and whatnot. They dealt with Nazis. Anyways, some of these countries just opted out, and like, I don't know, they don't play a big role. And there's some smaller countries in here. But yeah, here's just a physical image of these two different ideologies and how they were separated. So Germany specifically, let me try to get an idea of this map. So yeah, all of Germany then gets split up as well. So you have the orange, which is the Soviet zone, right? Obviously that's closer to Russia. You have the bottom here, which is the American zone. You have the French, which borders the French area, and then you have the British zone as well. So these are the four main countries or nations that came out as victors at the end of the World War II, and so they split up the German country. Why exactly, I can't remember, but part of the consequences of losing a fight. You don't get to negotiate the terms afterwards, okay? And then you also have Berlin. Maybe you have a better map. Okay. So you also have Berlin here that is split up. So East Berlin, right? So Berlin's right there. It's city. East Berlin is by the Russians, the southern part by the Americans, the middle part by the British, and the top part by the French. Okay. And so a friend of mine, he's German. He actually lives in Berlin. He was telling me that, like, if you go from one side of Berlin to the other, it's like you're moving into two different countries. They're that different, right? And I would assume a lot of this part of Germany might be a little bit less developed as well, just because they were under Russian communist rule for so long, right? And again, to make some of these connections to what we're learning and why maybe you should care about it is, our beliefs guide how we act in the world. Right? And so maybe in your own belief system, you think that, hey, you should work together with the people around you to get the best results. Or you should have a group of friends or a community of people to help you make the best decisions in your life. Right? Like you want open and free exchange of ideas. Okay, but maybe you think that, well, no, you should shelter. Like if you have something good going on, maybe you're a little worried about competition, that someone else will beat you. They'll be better at it than you, right? And so what emotions guide your actions? Like in one, are you coming out of a more positive place where, no, everybody can benefit, so we should share? Or is the other one kind of, you're acting, let's say, with jealousy of, well, I'm worried that if I tell this person the secret to my success, that they'll do better than me, and then I'll be out of a job, right? And so, these ideologies play a big impact in how the world functions and how these people existed. And we'll look at some photos and chat more about that later. But for many of these people who lived under the Soviet Union and communist rule, they lived lives of fear. They didn't have plenty. I was chatting with so I know a couple people who are from some of these areas, actually, you guys remember Mr. Shoyum from last year? Anyone? You don't remember him at all? A little bit, right? Some of you might have had his class. Mishak, please, let's not swear so much. You can just say, who's that? It's okay, we can forgive you. Anyways, so for those of you who do remember Mr. Shoyum, last year he was here. His family was from Hungary, I believe, and he grew up in one of the last few years of communist Russia, but his parents, his grandparents, they remember what it was like. I have another friend from Belarus. Her family, although they enjoyed a lot of public services and programs, she was telling me that her parents still remember having to line up to get bread, to get food. Even though the government gave them a house and whatnot, wages in those countries are still very low. Like you might only earn $100, $200 a month, which doesn't get you a lot. So these people did suffer by these ideological systems. Okay. So, sometimes there is this desire for economic and political power and control, and sometimes we act on that out of a variety of emotions. You could be scared of what will happen if you allow ideas to compete freely. You might be scared that, well, if the communists take over, it's going to be off with my own head, which we witness quite a bit. In some places, obviously there is that fear and worry, particularly, let's say, if you're on the left and the collective side, that, well, if we just let everyone compete freely, some of us are going to slowly sink to the bottom. And so the question of, well, what do you do with people, when they can't take care of themselves, when they sink to the bottom? How do you deal with that, right? Maybe that's going to be you. Right? I frankly don't know. You haven't really lived your lives yet, right? Living with your parents in school, you can see it grades-wise and effort as well, and attendance in that way, which isn't always an indicator of success long-term. But what do you do when a large part of the population feels like they can't really compete or take part in society because of the inability to compete? Maybe they don't have the skills. Right? One thing that's actually very uncomfortable for people to talk about is just, generally speaking, IQ. Right? Whether or not you believe in it is kind of irrelevant. I'm sure we've all met someone that we thought was very smart and someone that we thought was not very smart. If you're, statistically speaking, if you're lower on the IQ, if you're below 95 IQ, 85 IQ, how many jobs can you actually do? Can you actually manage taking care of yourself? And as a society, what is our response? How do we help those people, right? And on the flip side, when you have people who are very productive, how do you give them as many opportunities to continue being productive and effective? Okay, so there's a lot of reasons why people fight. I'm going to let you fill in notes. I need to chat with a student. Okay, I didn't get your letter. I didn't get the letter. Okay, just share it with me again, okay? Because I'm going to send them today. Okay, anyways, There's many ways to interpret a lot of the information here. So part of what happened after World War II is that obviously building more weapons. So particularly, there's one particular weapon that was very significant, that played a significant role in World War II. Anyone have an idea what it was? Anyone want to guess? What do we call that one? A nuclear bomb, right? So just a little side note, fun fact. Albert Einstein, he's a German, he leaves Germany, but before he does so, he writes a letter to the President of America. I forget which one was president at the time. And he warns them saying that, hey, listen, like the Germans are trying to invent a weapon that would change the course of the war. You need to invent it and, I guess, master it to an extent first, to the effect of this. It's been a while since I've read the letter, but he warns the Americans that, like, hey, listen, they're inventing something that will totally change the course of the war. You guys will lose. You need to solve this problem. And he flees Germany, and to some extent plays a role in the creation of the nuclear bomb. But anyways, the Americans somehow succeed. If you're interested in that, it's called the Manhattan Project. They develop a nuclear bomb, and they drop 2 nuclear bombs on Russia. I actually did a project on this when I was in high school, in grade 10, for social studies. What I learned back then was that they actually had 3 more, from my understanding, they had 3 more targets planned, but the Japanese surrendered after 2. And the first bomb was a deterrent, say, hey, stop what you're doing, this war's done. The second bomb, from what I understood from my research, was a threat to Russia. Look what we can do. Right? Because again, as I mentioned at the start, just because Russia, like, keep in mind, Russia changed sides. Like, they were with Germany initially, because they don't believe in democracy either, the way the communist states were running. They flipped sides because, you know, they didn't really want to deal with Germany and many other reasons. But the Americans, the West, generally speaking, they understood that, hey, these guys aren't really on our side. They don't support what we support. So we need to ensure that once the war is over with Germany and Japan, that Russia doesn't decide to take up arms. Right? So they develop these nuclear weapons. Well, now Russia doesn't want to be under the foot of these capitalist Americans. So what do? Well, it'd be worth looking into Project Paperclip. After the war is over and after this horrendous time in human history, modern human history, let's say, because I'm sure people 1,000 years ago did horrible things to one another. If you're curious, you could just Google Vlad the Impaler. Not a fun guy. Anyways, Project Paperclip, they took all of these Nazi scientists, all these people who played a significant role in developing Germany and their scientific programs, they took them out. The Americans took a whole bunch of scientists, the Russians took a whole bunch of scientists. They basically said to them, hey, we'll forget about your Nazi past, just help us build more weapons, help us win the war effort. All right, so how many of you like NASA? Raise your hand. Nobody? Wow, you kids are lame. Okay, NASA was founded and first run by a guy who's a Nazi. Right? What is his name? Werner von Braun, something like that. The guy was a Nazi. He ran a rocket factory in Germany for Hitler. He's responsible, if I understand and recall correctly, he's responsible for the V-2 rocket, which devastated a lot of Europe. But he later on, he was taken from the Nazis when Germany lost at some point. He was then reinstated in America to help build more weapons, right, to develop this aerospace program. Okay. What else do we want to chat about with this slide? Okay, and then territorial expansion as well. That plays a big role, and we'll look at some of the conflicts later on. We won't chat about that right now. Okay. I'm not sure I really need this in my slides. Anyways, you know, there's several conferences after the end of World War II to determine how things will play out afterwards. You know, this is mostly just discussions between, again, the liberal countries, the free world, and dealing with communist Russia. It's like what analogy could I give? You know, imagine there's a loose dog running around terrorizing the neighborhood. And once it's dealt with, you know, you want to make sure everyone in the neighborhood's still okay. Right? No one's going to sue anyone. No one's going to attack another person out of, you know, like, hey, your dog bit my child, or this dog bit my child. Now I'm angry. I'm going to take it out on someone. So they're kind of sorting out, like, between the three of them, you have Joseph Stalin, which is this guy over here on the right. It's kind of a blurry photo. I apologize. You have Franklin D. Roosevelt, who's in the middle, and then you have Winston Churchill, who's on this left side. These are the three main players, and you know they're trying to figure out they're puffing out their chest, trying to figure out who's going to run what, redrawing the map of Europe, planning how the war would end, the future for post-war Europe, how they're going to maintain peace, how they're going to continue trade. You know, that's what these conferences are all about. I'm going to move on. Okay, some key points. They are dealing with the surrender of Nazi Germany, the demilitarization and denazification. Okay, so all of these countries had expanded their militaries, and you know, for reasonable reasons, right? You're in the middle of a world war conflict on ideological grounds that literally mean life or death for many millions of people. Not that it didn't already. And then denazification, how do you pull Germany back from its extremeness? They've gone very anti-democracy, right? Like what we learned with Hitler. He took full control of the government, of decision making. So how do you pull people back? Right? And you know, if you want to consider that for your own life, like if you've ever been very angry or very upset at someone, how did you bring yourself back to a calm and reasonable state? Is that even something that's important or valuable? Right, so the same thing's going on at a nation level. How do you pull this country back from its extreme state? And we'll look at some of the solutions later on. Okay, they're splitting up Germany. This third point here is kind of important and probably very fascinating if you really look into the research, but once World War II ended, obviously Project Paperclip aside, the next thing that the world did was hunt down as many Nazis as they could, particularly after they created the Israeli state, or the Jewish state of Israel, I guess you could call it. They call it the Mossad, which is more or less like Israel's kind of secret service. I mean, these people hunted Nazis for decades. I think they just stopped like 10, 12 years ago. Right, so to give you an idea, they hunted them for almost 70 years, making sure, like to the end, every single Nazi from that time is dead or brought to justice. Okay. And they sent them to this place called The Hague, which is in the Netherlands, which was actually featured in one of the Call of Duty games like a couple of years back. Okay. Which is where they try war criminals, crimes against humanity, all that kind of stuff. German reparations, so in the form of forced labor. Labor is used to repair damage Germany inflicted on its victims. So again, Germany is not necessarily getting the short end of the stick financially, but they're also not being not blamed, let's say, right? Last 2 points here. So Stalin requested that all of the 16 Soviet Socialist republics would be granted UN membership. This was taken into consideration, but 14 republics were denied. And that's an interesting point. I highlighted that or underlined it because I feel like that was a very pivotal moment for the world. You know, it makes you wonder, like, if they had actually allowed these countries to the table of democracy, freedom, progress, how many of them would have had the fate that they ended up having by being denied? Like, how did this decision really impact the next 50 to 60 years? You know, a simple way to think about this is like, you know, imagine you find out your closest friend had a party and you weren't invited. And you didn't find out from them, you found out from someone else. Like, hey, where were you Friday night? What do you mean, what happened? Oh, your best pal threw a party. It was kind of weird you weren't there. Right? It almost feels like that. It's like there's a group being made, the United Nations, and some countries have asked to be a part of this group in whatever method they can be, but they were told no. And so you got to wonder, like, what did that decision have? What impact did that decision have 40, 50 years down the road? Also, a committee on dismemberment of Germany was to be set up. Its purpose was to decide whether Germany was to be divided into 6 nations. So again, they're really looking at, like, should we just dismantle this German nation? Which would have been ironic, you know, had they done that permanently, because that's essentially what they decided at the end of World War I. And where did that get them? World War II. Just give me a second, I'm going to see what's going on here. Okay, we'll do another 2 slides and then we'll wrap up for today. So we're getting close to the end of class. You also have the Potsdam Conference between American President Harry Truman. So again, like, Roosevelt ends up dying because he's like kind of old, not well. Stalin stays because, you know, he's Stalin, he's going to stay for a while. And Churchill, I think around this time, not long after he was voted out, I believe. Don't know the specifics on that. They gathered to decide how to administer punishment to the defeated Nazi Germany, which had agreed to unconditional surrender 9 weeks earlier on the 8th of May. Okay, so World War II didn't quite end in 1944. And obviously World War II included 2 main enemy forces, Japan and Germany. We don't really look that much into Japan, which is kind of fascinating because, you know, some of the most horrible things that people did to other human beings was done by the Japanese military. There's a Unit 731 is. No, I think it is. I believe there's a book called Unit 731, and it talks about this particular military unit in Japan during their imperial army and some of the horrific things they did in World War II, which, you know, we'll chat about for a bit. So I guess on that note of punishing Germany for some of what, or Nazi Germany for some of what it did, what I learned a long time ago was that most of the knowledge and research, information, scientific data we have on hypothermia and how it affects humans was gained by the Nazi regime. And the way they got that information was they basically just put Jewish people into freezing cold water, freezing cold temperatures, and just observed them. A very inhumane treatment. The Japanese, I think one of the things I had heard about was, like, it was something really bizarre. Like, they would just put boiling water on a person to see how those burns affected them. You know, just real horrific stuff that, you know, if you look at it, it's like, well, what is the purpose here? Is it to learn something interesting or unique about the human body, or is it just to torture and make people suffer? And there's also another really good book, The Rape of Nanking, about what the Japanese did in, I believe that's southern part of China. Anyways, you know, your curriculum doesn't really look into Japan as much and what was done there and how that happened. I don't know all the details as to why. We do look at Germany. So again, coming back to Germany, the goals of the Potsdam Conference included the establishment of post-war order, peace treaties, and countering the effects of the war. So we're essentially looking at how do you rehabilitate the world after there's been a massive conflict. Which is fascinating because we went through a global event that, again, rejected a lot of aspects of liberalism, a lot of restrictions on people's rights and freedoms. It's taken place during COVID. But we don't necessarily see the same push for how do you help the world recover from, you know, several months, several years of isolation. I'm sure, without a doubt, that that had an impact on everyone. You know, your education was completely took a hard left turn, or right turn, whatever you want to call it, when everything went online. Like some of you, what grades were you in when the pandemic hit? You're in grade 9. So that first, like March 15, when we shut down, you're in grade 9. Grade 10, we're not really in school. Then grade 11, it's half online, half in person. That was last year. Did we go online last year? No.
I think it was grade 10.
Okay, grade 10. All right, so grade 9 and 10, a big chunk of it, potentially sometime in grade 11. Like obviously we were still wearing masks last year. Like there was no basketball season last year, right?
No, there was.
Okay, but no one is allowed to watch.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, because I didn't watch and I was working at the school last year. Yeah. So there's this big impact on everyone's lives. Well, how do you deal with it? And sure, COVID and the lockdowns weren't potentially as traumatizing as a global conflict. Like imagine if people were dropping bombs on Edmonton and you lived in Leduc, right? And like several people you knew died. Like a lot of people you knew died potentially or didn't come back or were never the same. How do you counter the effects of this conflict? Okay, so just wrapping up, again, division of Germany. So the agreement of Potsdam included the division of Germany, restructuring of the German economy towards agriculture, industry, limited military production, an agreement that said that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan because they're still dealing with Japan at that point. The decision that Germany would pay $20 billion in reparations and the allowance that free elections would be held in Poland. Okay, this is on page 188. Okay, we'll stop there for today. Thank you very much.